Okay, Stephen.
Thank you, Sharon. We're going to give people a couple of minutes before we get started. We're still just opening up the line here for people to get in. So that'll take a minute or two.
Okay.
I see a few familiar faces. Nice to see folks. Hi, Luella.
Hi, Stephen. How are you?
Quite well, thanks.
This is getting to be a habit 2 days. Oh, there's Sharon over there too. Look at that. Hi, my friend.
Hi, Jose. 2 days or 3 days in a row or something.
Hey there, Linda. Yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, I heard, Linda, you were the keynote at that conference you was participating in.
Yep.
Sorry, Jose, I missed you up there.
Hey, Luella, so good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
How are you doing these days?
Oh, getting old, but keeping busy.
I'm actually, I feel like I could respond the exact same way.
Oh, you're very, very young yet, you know.
I don't feel that young anymore.
Oh, that's right. I remember you were just a little kid when we met first time.
Yeah, I was. That's true.
Right.
I was just a little kid.
Now you're an old married man with a baby and all.
I am, yes. I'm losing hair. It's
Oh.
down here from here, Luella.
Well, you see, mine changed color, so since you last saw me.
Well, it looks good. I like it.
Okay, well, thank you, sir.
All right, why don't we get started? I'll want to welcome everybody. My name, my name's Steve Lester. I'm the science director here at CHEJ, and I want to welcome everybody to our monthly seminar and training series. We have a special guest with us today, and before I introduce her, I want to just sort of lay out how we're going to manage today. We have quite a few people who've registered, and I hope will be on the call with us today. But this is mostly going to be an opportunity for people to ask questions directly with Linda. I'm going to begin the questions with maybe 15 minutes of questions that I'll raise with Linda, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. I'm going to ask people to put their questions in the chat so we can kind of keep track of it. And Jose, who you've just heard a little bit from, will be reading those questions out to the floor. A couple of times I will ask, we'll unmute everybody and I'll ask for questions in general, because I know some people may be calling in and not be able to put questions in the chat or may have trouble. So there'll be an opportunity to do that once or twice before we're done. So with that said, let's get started. Let me welcome Linda Birnbaum. I think many of you know Linda and know her background and her history. It's really a great honor and pleasure to welcome her and to invite her to have her here as our guest today. Linda has so many awards and recognitions, and I don't want to go through all of that or repeat it. It's a short version of it is in the invite that you all received. If you're not familiar with Linda, please take a minute, take a look at it. She's a remarkable individual, and I would call her one of the leading scientists, not just in the United States, but in the world. It's really a pleasure to have Linda with us today, and Linda, welcome.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with folks who are interested in CHEJ. You should have started off by saying how long we know each other, and how far we go back, and some of the interesting travels we have had together.
Very true. Very true. I mean, we had the pleasure of spending some time together in Russia, which was really quite remarkable before it was what it is today. And my God, what it is today is another whole thing.
Yeah, it was 96, I think, or 97, and it was kind of a scary place to be, actually.
Yeah, 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 very different. So so Linda, let me begin by asking you kind of an off the cuff kind of question, not really a question about science, but it is about science, and it's really about when you were growing up, when you were a young girl, young lady, and you were thinking about the world in front of you. And let me ask, did you see yourself as a scientist, as a young person trying to figure out who you were? I mean, did you have ambitions to be something other than that, or were you always kind of in that track?
No, not really. I mean, by the time I was in high school, I was excited about biology and science. But before that, what really, I mean, we're going back, guys. Luella, you said you're getting older and busier. I think the same thing was true, but we're going back 60 years when it was very unusual for a girl to want to be anything other than a librarian or a secretary or a nurse or a teacher. But when it was actually middle school, and I was a cheerleader, and my cheerleading coach was also my science teacher. And she was young and peppy and married. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, I could, she made it okay for me to like science. And I always did well in science. And I have to say that it was also fun frequently, especially in high school, if I got into the more advanced science classes, that I was often the only girl in the class, which, or one of few, that was also kind of fun. So anyway, that's kind of, that's how I got into liking science and definitely enjoying it.
Nice, nice. What brought you into the track of environmental health and public health?
I think a lot of that was happenstance, taking advantage of situations that arose. I actually, I majored in biology in college. Then I ended up in a microbiology department where I was the first person to map the genes for ribosomal RNA in E. coli, and then actually to transcribe that RNA. This is going back to the early 70s, and what I did took so much gut work. I think I spent weeks pouring plates, for example, pouring Petri plates and stuff. But eventually, I decided a lot of my training was really much more in molecular biology than standard microbiology. I mean, you got to call yourself a microbiologist. I took one and I taught one, and that made you a microbiologist. Most of my classes were actually in biochemistry and physical chemistry. I decided then that I wanted to advance beyond, I felt like molecular biology wasn't going anywhere until it actually, unless there were major technological breakthroughs, this was really before restriction nucleases. And they didn't happen until 1975. So I went and did a postdoc in biochemistry where I went from bacteria to yeast. I thought I was going to the big time. I went from, a prokaryote to a eukaryote. And there I was trying to actually transcribe and translate the mitochondrial genome. That postdoc wasn't very successful. And I say part of it was that I was a new mom. And frankly, I was not happy spending, not being with my little boy all the time. So I remember I walked into the chair of the department's office and I said, you have a choice. You either let me work part-time or I quit. He wasn't paying my postdoc. I had won a postdoctoral fellowship award from the Damon Runyon Cancer Foundation. So he was happy to say, sure, as long as you promise to kind of work out the time. So I did that. And then my husband moved his job from Amherst College. We went to upstate New York, and I spent a year teaching at Hamilton College on a visiting appointment. But Hamilton had a real problem with the faculty life being faculty. And then I had our second child, and I started looking for something in the Utica, New York area, which is not the center of the academic or research universe, but I was lucky. There's a small research institute there called the Masonic Medical Research Institute, which is on the grounds of the Masonic home for the state of New York. And I was, their focus was they were going to solve the problems of biological aging. And so I got involved with a group that was looking at altered metabolism as a function of age. And we had aging colonies of both rats and mice. And some of the chemicals that I used to increase metabolism were some of what today are some of my favorite, and I put favorite in quotes, environmental chemicals like PCBs and benzpyrene and 3-methylchloranthrene and that kind of thing. After we had spent about 4.5 years in upstate New York, my husband and I kind of looked at each other and we said, well, there's something wrong with this picture. It snows on Halloween. It snows on commencement in May. We'd kind of had it. So this time it was his job to follow me, and I was able to get a advanced postdoctoral position at NIEHS, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And I had to actually look up what I was joining the nascent National Toxicology Program. This is kind of at the end of the summer, 1979, and I had never even heard the word toxicology. Anyway, kind of the rest is history. We moved to North Carolina, never left, decided was a great place. We loved being there. We loved raising our kids there. I spent about 10.5 years at NIEHS. I received tenure. Again, if anyone had told me in 1979, when I began working with TCBD dioxins, that I would still be interested in them, over 40 years later, I would probably not have believed them. But I am, and I did lots of work on that. And I also got into some developmental kinds of studies and mechanistic studies relating to the adverse effect of environmental chemicals. So it was kind of by getting involved at NIEHS, that's how I got into kind of environmental health. After spending a little over 10 years at NIEHS, I was recruited to head the largest health research division at US EPA. And that was literally at that point about 2.5, 3 miles down the road from where NIEHS was, which frankly was, I can't think of a more perfect way to, what shall I say? You know, I didn't have to move my family in order to make a major career move. So I spent 19 years at EPA, about 17.5, running this very large health research division. The focus of our division was a lot of impacts on inhalation studies, so a lot of studies of air pollution. So we were looking primarily at PM and ozone, somewhat sulfur and nitrous oxides. We were looking at immunosuppression and immune effects. This was all rats and mice. And then we were looking at renal and liver toxicity, pharmacokinetics, and I really got into the dioxin work even more and continued it. I would say I spent 1 year when I was director of, when I was on detail to run the human studies division that EPA had, which was actually on the grounds of UNC's hospital. And that turned out to be a fabulous opportunity because all of a sudden I was in charge of clinical studies. So before that, I had no idea what was entailed in doing a clinical study, like ethical approval, dealing with patients, etc. And it was also the group that did a lot of epidemiology. So I learned something about epidemiology. My last 2 years, I would say, at EPA, or 1.5 years, I actually spent in the risk assessment part of the Office of Research and Development. Mainly, I was allowed to kind of do my own thing. I did do some risk assessments for Superfund chemicals, but one of the challenges I had that was exciting and learned a lot was to coordinate the EPA response to the asbestos pollution in Libby, Montana. And Libby is one of those beautiful mountain towns and valleys near the Canadian border, in northern Montana, near Idaho, actually, that looks idyllic, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and so on. But there was a vermiculite mine just outside the boundaries of the town, which was very generous in donating a lot of its backfill, because it was so rich in vermiculite to the town. So all the schools and all the homes had taken advantage of this nice topsoil kinds of stuff and used it in their gardens. But unfortunately, it turned out that sometimes the vermiculite was as much as 50% asbestos. So you had a small town here with huge numbers of people with mesothelioma, asbestosis, and so on. So I was coordinating the headquarters response, or the ones who set the regulations, the research response, which was not only animal studies and mechanistic studies and human studies, but also all the exposure and engineering studies, and then the actual work on the ground, which was, let's just say, exciting, but also really quite challenging.
Imagine it was, yeah.
You know, so anyway, and then I was recruited back to NIEHS. At the time that I was recruited back to NIEHS, I was actually considering retiring from the government. I'd been in the government about 27 years at that point. And I was in negotiations with Duke University for a position over at Duke. I had been an adjunct at Duke and at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for years and years and years. And the only time it becomes a problem is basketball season. But other than that, it's been great. And those adjunct appointments allowed me not only to interact with students a lot, but it allowed me to have many graduate students especially, but also some undergraduates and postdocs go through my own lab. Okay. So that's kind of a brief. And then I joined NIEHS and spent almost 11 years there. And I would say I loved 95% of it. I will say it was quite difficult under the Trump administration. There was a lot of censoring that went on of what I wanted to say, because I caused problems to the department when I said that some chemical, for example, was carcinogenic or caused adverse health effects. Industry would get very upset and would send nasty letters to Congress, and Congress would send them on to me, etc. So I did retire at the end of 2019. And I'm very glad that I was not at the Institute during the pandemic, or during the worst part of the pandemic. I was granted emeritus status by the Intramural Research Program of NIH. So that allows me to still have access. I have a small lab, which is frankly starting to wind down now. And, you know, I still maintain somewhat of a presence there, although during the pandemic, things have been so restricted about who can go where, when, kind of thing. But since I've retired, I've been super busy speaking, working with different advocacy groups, especially here in North Carolina. We have major problems here with the contamination of the entire Cape Fear River watershed, where Chemours, which used to be the DuPont, has produced these kinds of chemicals for about 60 years. And for the first over 50 years, they just dumped them into the river. So we have a contamination up and down the river. We have contamination in the fish, and the entire drinking water supply for Wilmington, North Carolina is contaminated highly with these chemicals. So I'm working with, there's a coalition of about 6 different advocacy groups and CEH. We've actually petitioned EPA to conduct some studies on health effects from these contaminants in the river. EPA says they met the petition, but in fact, they met about 1% of it. So we're currently in legal investigation.
Huh,
And
interesting.
yeah. So
Like to
anyway,
be-
I think it's keeping me super busy, and it's super fun.
Uh-huh. Well, you might get a different perspective now if you're working with this grassroots group.
Well, I think, Stephen, you know this, and other people who know me or know of me.
Yeah.
One of my, I would say, objectives at NIEHS, I'd say there were a couple. One was to make the whole bigger than the sum of the parts, because NIEHS, like any NIH institute, has a robust intramural program, and then it has the grants given for the extramural program. And of course, we had a third part because NIEHS is also the headquarters for the National Toxicology Program, which also involves part of FDA and part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And that is also another intramural program. And what I wanted to make sure of was that all parts of my program spoke together. I was horrified when I first went to the Institute, or when I first went back as director, to find that people never spoke. You know, if, for example, the intramural program was having a symposium and bringing in speakers on something, they'd never invite any of the people from the extramural program or the NTP, and you know, that went through. So I think we did that. But another thing is that I really truly believe is that you can't do environmental health research unless you involve yourself with the communities. And that is a huge range of different kinds of communities, because the communities are the ones who are most aware of what the problems are. So I did, I called them town halls, which were basically public forums that I did several a year in different parts of the country, often in different minority communities, quite a number on with some of our indigenous partners. So Steve and I were talking about Alaska and the Alaska communities against toxics, and I held a couple meetings up there, including going to the home of the Siberian Yupik, which is a tiny island in the Bering Sea, about on the international date line, which is highly contaminated because of two reasons. One is that the Air Force, it was home for Air Force bases, listening bases during the Cold War. And when the Air Force left, China just poured all their contaminants right into the water and the soil, permafrost and stuff around there. You don't have to dig far to find PCB oils and stuff. But the other thing is that any of our indigenous peoples in the far north, if they're eating their traditional diet, which you'd like them to be able to eat, contaminants don't stay in temperate climates, they move. And so our most contaminated peoples for the persistent organic pollutants are those peoples in the far north. And that includes the PCBs and the DDTs and the dioxins and some of the brominated flame retardants. And we're now finding that they also have a lot of PFAS that have traveled around.
Yeah.
So I think I've said enough about what I've done.
Yes, it's great. Thank you, though. That's a great introduction to all the many wonderful things you've been involved in. I'm going to ask just one question, and then we'll throw it open to the group. My question to you, Linda, is you mentioned many of the things you've done at EPA, including the risk assessment piece, but can you talk a few minutes about the challenges of evaluating health effects in people who have been exposed to toxic chemicals? Talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know.
First of all, I'll say it's a really difficult problem. When you're dealing with, say, general population contamination, which is what we have in this country, we all have hundreds of different synthetic chemicals that have been introduced into our world and into our bodies. It's very, very difficult to conduct observational human studies and have clear answers. Traditionally in medicine, you do double-blind randomized controlled trials where you have people that you don't expose to some kind of drug, and then you have people you do expose to some kind of drug. And because you're looking for some kind of beneficial effect, it's ethical to do that kind of study. Well, we're not going to intentionally expose people to something like PCBs or dioxins because we have enough data from animals to know that they're problematic. And so you have to do it by observational studies. There are a number of things that we can do. First of all, many of our understandings of environmental chemicals come from high dose exposures that can occur in occupational settings. Now, I would say sometimes that can lead us astray because in those high dose occupational settings, you're often looking for an acute effect. For example, for VOCs, you're often looking for someone who goes in to clean a tank and gets overwhelmed by the fumes and has a heart attack or something. Well, those aren't the kind of levels we're seeing in the general population. So frequently in the general population, we're looking for long-term chronic effects. But you've got to look, you know, if you look at our population and you look at our health conditions, let's look at what's increasing in the health populations overall. Well, we're seeing more and more heart disease or cardiovascular disease. We see more and more cancer. Right now, we have an epidemic of obesity. And I should say that's not only in the US, but we have an epidemic. We have a huge increase in type 2 diabetes. We have increases in things like autism spectrum disorders, which has increased from, I would say about 15 years ago, it was 1 in 120 children. And now it's about 1 in 44 are diagnosed somewhere on the spectrum. People on the autism spectrum don't go off the spectrum. So much of the focus has been on dealing with children on the spectrum. We have in many ways ignored the opportunities that we can have with people who are neurodifferent. We have increases in ADHD tremendously. So there are these neurodevelopmental effects, and we have more and more evidence for fertility issues. If you go to a country like Denmark, over 20% of the babies require assisted reproductive technologies to be born. In the US, there are very large numbers of people who are requiring fertility help. Now, the world doesn't have a problem with fertility, but for an individual couple, it can be a personal disaster. We also see increases, you know, I mentioned cancer, and often you'll hear, oh, you know, fewer people are dying of certain kinds of cancer, like breast cancer, and that's true. But the incidence of breast cancer keeps going up. So women are getting breast cancer, but we are better at treating and curing. As a public health person, I want to prevent disease. I mean, how much better to prevent than have to treat and cure? And with environmental issues, if we can find what in the environment is impacting our health, at least theoretically, we should be able to do something about it. So we knew 30 years ago about the horrible air pollution. I'm just looking at a small subset of the people on the line, and I can see there are other people who kind of look like me with nice gray hair and so on. And, you know, I'll never forget the kind of yellow smog that I would see sometimes when, like, I was a teenager in the late 60s. I remember the first time I was hiking out in California in Sequoia National Park, and you could look down on the valleys and there was this brown line, you know, and that's probably in the 90s. Our air pollution here in the US is much better than it used to be, but it's still not good enough. The estimates are that there are still almost 400,000 cardiovascular deaths a year that are associated with elevated air pollution. We know that below the regulatory standards that EPA has set, people are still, especially older people, are still have an increased risk of mortality. One of the things that's problematic, again, in doing observational human environmental epidemiology kind of studies, is there's no such thing as a control group anymore because everybody's exposed. So what you need to do is have ways of differentiating between levels of exposure in populations, which sometimes you can do because you may have a population. Well, I'll just mention, for example, in West Virginia, near Parkersburg, West Virginia, where there's a large DuPont plant, which again, dumped lots of contaminants into the creeks and streams near it and then contaminated parts of the Ohio River. So you had people who were drinking this water for 40 or more years. And then you had populations who were very similar in socioeconomic status and ethnic status, and you have similar ranges of ages and so on. And you could use them as a part of your larger study. But those people tend to have lower blood levels of the contaminants than the people who were right near the DuPont plant.
Mhm.
So that can give you a range, and that helps. Now you can do that if you have a way of measuring what people are exposed to. Well, sometimes you don't have a good way to do it. But again, some of the kinds of human studies that are really helpful to do are longitudinal studies. We do a lot of what's called cross-sectional, whereas you go in at a point in time, you measure what's in people, you measure what's in the environment, and you look at their health conditions. Well, guess what? If I find PCBs in you today, and you have cancer today, that doesn't mean the PCBs gave you cancer, because cancer is a long latency. Well, PCBs probably weren't a good example, because in fact, PCBs have very long half-lives. So what's in you today you had lots of it in you 10 years ago, 20 years ago as well. I should have said something like benzene or another VOC or certain other kinds of compounds which don't hang around in our body. But the advantage of longitudinal studies is you can take measurements and then follow people over time, not only follow their contaminant level, but you can follow their health over time. And that improves the ability to determine whether their exposures are impacting their health. But again,
Yes.
let me just say nobody's exposed to one thing. So we're in a soup. And it's not always easy to differentiate, or you have to try to control for all these other things if you're trying to look at exposure to, say, one chemical contaminant or one group of contaminants.
Great. All right, great. So that sort of begins to touch on all the complexities and the difficulties for sure. So rather than go back or continue that line of thought, let's take some questions from the chat so we can, so you can address some of the questions people are asking.
Sure.
So Jose, why don't you pull out a couple of those questions? And I should have mentioned, people hopefully have mentioned their names as they put their questions in, so we can repeat that. So go ahead, Jose.
Yeah, I was able to capture the questions that are on the chat, and I'm just going to go through them from top to bottom, and I hope that I can capture the essence of your question. So Karen Spencer, you were the first one, and you asked Linda if she could comment on the impact of fluoridation policy on three, I guess, populations: pregnant mothers and bottle-fed babies, those who consume more water than typical, including kidney patients and diabetics, and the short and long-term impact on those with autoimmune disease and chemical sensitivities.
Okay, I'll take a stab. I think I'm going to have the most information on the first part of the question, which really has to do with the developmental neurotoxicity of fluoride. I am quite convinced by the burgeoning literature, and this is really based largely on the human data, that elevated fluorine is a problem for the development of babies' brains. I should say the brain develops very early in utero, and then brain development continues through actually about age 25, but the real critical windows appear to be early in utero and early infantile. There is no good data today showing that fluoridation protects against cavities. That was the basis of the 1962 Public Health Advisory, in which the levels were set at 1.2 ppm inorganic fluoride being put in the water. But as more and more fluoride is present in our environment overall, I think everyone, just about everyone, uses fluoridated toothpaste, fluoridated mouthwash. A lot of, especially black teas, have high levels of fluoride in them, and so on. We get lots of fluoride from environmental sources that we don't really need it added to our drinking water anymore. I initiated a program when I was director of NTP to do a systematic review of fluoride neurotoxicity. Let's just say we've been waiting for those reviews to be actually published. Drafts were sent to the national academies, which I had decided upon doing rather than our normal external peer review process because of the political nature of drinking water fluoridation. There's a very, very strong dental lobby that believes that fluoridation is protective against tooth decay. I will say there is no benefit of ingested fluorine. The benefits of fluorine to teeth are topical. So swishing as an adult, or even as not a very young child, but a child, is probably going to be fine. Remember, you swish and they tell you to spit it out, you don't swallow it, but there's no benefits to ingested fluorine. So I actually wrote an editorial, I think, my goodness, now it's a year and a half or 2 years ago, where I called for pregnant women not to drink fluoridated water. And of course, we all encourage that breast is best if women can to nurse their babies, because fluorine is not transmitted through breast milk to the babies. But if you're going to use formula for your baby, please don't use fluoridated water. I just checked with some of my former colleagues at NTP. This report has been scheduled to be released multiple times. Report repeatedly delayed. The person who was my associate director of NTP, who's now working as a volunteer to get this report out, feels that it will finally come out. We had another release date of May 18th, which just passed, and he is hopeful that it will finally come out soon. But it has been a long, arduous process. I am not terribly familiar with the impacts that fluoride might have on the kidney or its autoimmune effects. I know, at high concentrations, we know that fluoride can be associated with skeletal fluorosis. At slightly elevated concentrations, I was on a committee with the Public Health Service that in 2015, we lowered the recommended level. If you were going to do it in drinking water, we lowered it from 1.2 ppm to 0.7 ppm. I think it needs to come way down below that, if we even need it at all. But there are issues about social justice for populations who are not as economically privileged, be able to still get fluoride if we take it out of the drinking water. I mean, we really need EPA to do another major source contribution study and kind of look at the question, if we take it out of the drinking water sources, what will that mean for soda pop? What will that mean for other sources and so on?
Right.
So I hope that's enough of an answer.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That's a very good answer. Great. All right,
Absolutely.
Jose.
So, Linda, I'll kind of double down with another question about related to fluoridation as well. John Mueller here asked with reference to a TSCA trial and the position of Judge Chen regarding evidence that you put in in an op-ed back in 2020, apparently.
Right.
So the question is, do you think that the White House environmental justice initiatives are pertinent to the TSCA trial and add more weight to the evidence supporting a ban on adding fluoridation chemicals to public water supplies?
It would be nice if we could get additional advocacy pressure to get this out. I can tell you Judge Chen has been phenomenal. I've been working as a kind of just an advisor to FAN, which is Fluoridation Action Network somewhat, and I've been talking a lot to both Paul Connett and Michael Connett, who is the lead lawyer on that trial. And Dr. Chen has been really waiting for the NTP systematic review to be finalized and released, I think, to make his decision. It's frankly hard to understand why EPA has not regulated TSCA, and really whether, I think that, I'm not sure is the regulation, I just don't remember whether it's under TSCA or under the Office of Drinking Water, or FDA hasn't regulated it because it is used as a drug and should really be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration.
Okay, thanks.
Got it. Thank you. So there's another question here. Let's see. From David Dow, and he asked if the SCWA/CERCLA cleanup at Joint Base Cape Cod recently placed granular activated carbon filters on public drinking water wells in Falmouth to remove PFAS, perchlorate, and 1,4-dioxin, I guess.
Dioxane.
Dioxane. Gotcha.
Dioxane.
Yep. So he asks, how effective is this cleanup approach in your view?
Okay, I am not a remediation specialist, but granular activated carbon does a good job removing many organic compounds. I do not know how it works with perchlorate. I do not know how, it's really hard to get rid of 1,4-dioxane. It will do a good job at removing the long chain, which are kind of the legacy PFAS, the PFOA and the PFOS, which many people have heard about. It does not do a great job of removing the unfortunate substitutes, which are many of the shorter chain PFAS, which are now being extensively used in products and commerce and so on. And whenever you do filtration, and now you have a concentrated filtrate, which has all these contaminants, what do you do with it? PFO and PFOS are, President Biden announced about a year ago that he was going to get them listed as hazardous waste so that they would fall under CERCLA. That hasn't really happened yet. There's a great deal of pushback, in part from many of the water authorities, because they're going to be the ones who have to deal with a lot of this, and which means they're going to have to increase the rates to their taxpayer. So, I mean, many of us are working through other means to try to get the polluter to pay rather than your water consumers. So, you know, it's great to get what you can out of the water. I'm a pragmatist. Steve can tell you this. You know, it may not get us all the way that we want to go, but say getting the PFO and the PFOS and some of the other long chains out is better than not getting them out. But I'd like to get, well, we're never going to get rid of all the PFAS. I mean, these are chemicals that are completely environmentally persistent. There's no evidence that they break down in the environment. And we've got to work to turn off the tap, because as long as we keep developing and using, we now have there over 12,000 PFAS that have been identified in commerce, in the environment, in people. You know, there's no way that we can test them all or get rid of them all.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that, Linda. So I have another question here. Let's see. Dennis O'Meara asks, would you comment on the following quote from a paper published in 2017? The quote is, scientists have found that the amount of toxic chemical lined with the with the development of a disease or death, which is central to determining safe or hazardous levels, is proportionally greater at the lowest dose or levels of exposure.
I'm not sure that's true with every chemical, but it has certainly been shown to be true with something like benzene. It's going to sound probably a little bad, but you get the biggest bang for the buck at the lowest doses. In other words, if you look at a curve of response, what you'll see is you have a very, very steep increase with very low doses, and then you kind of reach a maximum point. Now, you either reach that maximum point because you've done all the damage that can be done, that after that you have maybe lethality or something, but there are a number of things. So for example, with benzene, where they have looked at very, very low levels of exposure, this is mainly studies coming from China. And I should say there's a huge amount of work, and much of it is really good coming out of China. What you can see is mutations in DNA. You get the most mutations at the lowest levels of exposure. And so that's true for a number of different kinds of compounds. So we have this mantra in toxicology that the dose makes the poison. And that's true up to a point, but it ignores the shape of the dose response curve. It ignores that for some things, both low doses and high doses are bad, and there may be a dose in the middle where you don't see much happening. And it ignores the fact that timing is everything. And timing is both life stage timing, as well as acute versus, repeated versus kind of chronic exposures.
Right, thank you for that. And I guess you can add to that cumulative exposures as well, right? Of multiple, I guess you could add also cumulative exposures of multiple chemicals that may affect the same endpoint.
Well, that's true. And in fact, the recent recommendations from EPA that have just been through part of their science advisory board is that a dose addition approach is probably the most appropriate kind of approach to use, where you kind of add up the compounds. Now for dioxin, we did that with a relative potency factor approach, which has been used extensively in cleanup operations, but it's also been used for things like PAHs, and it may start to be used for some of the PFAS as well. But they've actually said that there are a number, the EPA draft guidance, and then things that are in the literature recently are suggesting that you don't have to have the same mechanism of action. If you're affecting the same target tissue, you can kind of add things up. And we all live in a soup, and we haven't done a very good job of dealing with the fact that it's a soup and not one chemical at a time.
Exactly. Here's a question, and I'm not sure that I understand.
Let me just, I'm not sure how many questions you have, but let me just take a break here and ask if there's anybody on the phone who has not been able to enter a question into the chat who has a question. Anybody on the phone?
Yeah, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask if you're on the phone.
Stephen, I don't see any phone numbers.
Okay, all right, great. All right, so we can go back to the chat then.
Okay, great.
All right.
So this is a question from Virginia. And Virginia, if you're there, I didn't see you, but if you're there, feel free to unmute yourself, because I'm not sure that I will read your question appropriately. But her question is, Linda, would you be willing to share what physicians in Boston align with your focus, who are willing and able to care for MCS/environmental illness, childhood Goodyear removed?
So I'm not a physician, and I'm not aware, I don't know that many physicians who deal well with environmental. There is a woman on Martha's Vineyard, Lisa Nagy, or Nage, I think how you sell it, but it's spelled N-A-G-Y, who is an expert in environmental diseases. And I would suggest that you reach out to her.
Right, that didn't work out. Thank you.
I'm
That's
sorry.
actually better. Thank.
Okay.
I know. I just think you much for being on this call. God bless you. Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't be more helpful.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, several coming in right now, actually, but I'll try to get to all of them. Let's see. Marguerite Adelman asks, she has read some articles recently on sulfide and iodine and ultraviolet, and how they break down PFAS. Is that really a practical solution, or do we end up with more toxins in the water?
It's a great question. I'm not an expert on those approaches to PFAS remediation. There are a number of experimental approaches that are being talked about. I mean, Jose, you and I were both at a 2-day meeting looking at those issues. Nothing is very successful yet. There are things that work on the benchtop, but they haven't been tried out in the field yet. And I still think that one of the biggest issues we have, for example, people will talk about incineration because at very high temperatures, the same kind of temperatures we had to do with dioxins, you can, at least theoretically, break down PFAS, but there's lots of stuff that doesn't get break down, and often that gets released into the air, and then we end up inhaling it. Or it travels and lands on cropland or forage, and our animals and our plants can incorporate it. So I am not yet convinced that we have good solutions to remediation for PFAS. Yes, we can filter it out. I talked before that granular activated charcoal does not remove all the unfortunate substitutes or the short chain PFAS. You can go to reverse osmosis or some nanotechnology filtration processes, which can remove it all. We're still then left with this concentrated filtrate, and what do we do with it? I know we are all we're all concerned about landfills, even lying landfills.
Absolutely, and I know one of the technologies that was mentioned at the conference was, I believe it was superoxidation of water or in water, and how that, I mean, it uses the same concept as incineration, but in liquid kind of form. But I mean, I think there are still a lot of questions that need to be answered about things like that before we find something that truly works in the field.
That's correct. I will say that the Department of Defense is spending tens of millions of dollars trying to develop destructive technologies for PFAS because they have contaminated the drinking water supplies of about 100 million Americans.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Chris, I'm sorry, I won't be able to pronounce your last name well, but I believe it's Nurath. He asks, so a problem that environmental activists deal with is that industry captures government agencies like EPA, ATSDR, FDA, and others. I've been working mostly on the specific toxic chemical fluoride. Now that you're out of government, would you be willing to discuss the problem of regulatory capture and how citizen activists can try to get around it?
It's a great question. It's absolutely true, especially in the regulatory agencies, even in the non-regulatory agencies. Remember, if it's the agencies are all part of the executive branch, report to whoever the president is, as well as they have to be responsive to congressional demands. And I'm going to say something which is probably not nice, but I think it's true. We have the best government and the best regulations that money could buy. So a tremendous amount of lobbying. I used to get very nasty letters from Congress people, senators and representatives, that I would get the same letter word for word, but on different heading from Congress that I would get, for example, from the American Chemistry Council or other chemical trade groups. The way that the legislation is often written is that there has to be opportunities for public comment before regulations go into effect or decisions are made. And industry has lots more money than citizen groups to spend on doing that. When I was at NTP, I changed our process for technical external peer review of our documents. We still did, I think we had 9 times where we sent things out for public comment, but the in-person public comment period, I switched to doing it all virtual, other than the committee and the NTP folks in the room, because otherwise what would happen is you were allowed often like 7 minutes to make comments, and 300 environmental groups would send one person to represent 300 groups, but industry would send 15 people, 20 people, 30 people, all making their comments. And so by making everything virtual, it basically leveled the playing field somewhat for that. I'm not an expert for sure on all the different regulations or on all the laws, but I think until we can get money out of our campaigns, we're in it's a very difficult situation. When I look at what is spent on some of the litigation that goes on related to cleanup, for example, it's an obscenity. And I say that both from the plaintiff side and the, industry side, because that money could be used for so much better purposes than arguing what the harms are of things. There's a real problem people don't understand with environmental health, that we're often not looking for something in a person. I can't say, Steve, if you had a little less blood lead when you were a kid, you'd have 5 more IQ points. You can look at a population and see the shift in the distribution of that population. And what you see is more children being put in an at-risk category where they need several special services, and fewer children, for example, being in the genius category. But there are things that you can't actually measure what would have happened if you hadn't had the exposure. So we're often looking for subtle effects, where many people in our population have some kinds of heart disease. It's really hard to show what has increased that risk. You have to really do it often on a population basis. Think of all the drugs that are approved by FDA after extensive testing, and then all of a sudden when they go out into the general population, you start getting reports of adversity, and it's because all of a sudden you have large enough populations that you start looking at people who are more susceptible. Now we know that the developing fetus, we know that infants, we know that adolescents, we know that pregnant women, we know that older people are all susceptible populations. But who do we do most of our testing on for things? Healthy young adults. In fact, until 1992, NIH didn't even require testing on women. So testing for lots of drugs that were intended for women's use were done on men. Well, viva la différence. What we've really learned is that men and women behave and respond very differently. So you'll have industry saying, oh, well, no. You'll have FDA actually put out a white paper about a year ago where they said, oh, if you don't have the same response in men and women, it's clearly not real. Well, that's just not true. And we all know from very, very early stages, you can see difference, for example, in male and female fetuses, male and female infants. So I think we just have to be aware of the fact that we have differential susceptibility because of age. We have differential susceptibility because of genetics. Nothing is just genes and nothing is just environment. It's the intersection between the two. And
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'm waxing eloquent.
So Stephen, I just wanted to take a break just to see how much time we have left.
Yeah, we have about a minute or two. And
Well, Stephen, we can go longer. I set it up to go longer if you want to.
well, I'm not sure that's fair to our guest. We told her it would be an hour, and I think we should.
I could stay, Steve, another couple minutes, like another 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Linda. So
Okay.
we can do that then. All right, so we won't close it right this minute then. So if there's a few more questions in the chat, we can do that. And if not, I can ask one.
We have several questions. I'm going to try to get to some of the newer ones, just so that we can give people some chance to ask away. I have one more. Dolores Pino asked, in your experience, I guess, Linda, are there specific federal legislative reforms to the current federal environment or law structure that you recommend?
As I said, I'm really not an expert. I am working very closely with a group of EPA alums. These are not necessarily people who retired from EPA, but they're people like me. Some of them are, but many of them are people like me who worked at EPA for some part of their career. And we had developed a roadmap, which was provided to the Biden administration when it took over, about approaches that EPA should could work on. Many of us are trying to comment on a lot of the things that EPA is doing. I would say different parts of EPA have different strengths, let's say challenges and opportunities. So at the moment, I think the Office of Pesticides, I think the Office of OCS, the Office of Community Support and Pesticide Prevention, something like that, used to be called Toxics and Pesticides, has some of the worst problems. And that is because that is the office that either is running pesticide assessments or consumer chemicals and commerce assessments. And so they are ones that are hugely captured by industry. I would say the Air Office does pretty well in moving ahead. It would really be nice if the Hazardous Waste Office, which is now called OLAM, Office of Land and Environmental Management, and that's where hazardous waste and Superfund programs are, would start charging the polluters for the Superfund cleanups. That has been very little of that done for 20 or more years. I think that the Office of Water, I'm pleased with what they're doing right now, at least with PFAS, or the approaches. They haven't bought into what many of us are calling from, which is the large class approach, but they have finally gotten out risk assessments for PFOA and PFOS, and they are thousands of fold more stringent than what they had done about 6 years ago. That they have committed to actually putting out an MCL by the end of this year. They're supposed to report an MCL that will have then like a year of comment. It'll be promulgated about a year later. Once a maximum contaminant level is set, it becomes a legal limit, and the industry will give them 3 years to meet it. But that at least is some movement ahead, and they're the ones with the mixtures strategy, which I think is quite good. So I think that's encouraging. I'm not so happy with what they've done with, say, with the fluoride issues. Anyway, I think so. I'm working very closely with others, and there are about 500 former EPAers who are involved with EPN. People are more active in different parts related to their experience, but there are many former assistant administrators, which are, you know, your highest level of management from EPA, as well as scientists at all levels.
Got it. Thank you.
We met with those folks, Linda, just so you know.
Oh, good.
They
Great.
reached out to us to let us know who they were and what they were doing.
And they would very much like to hear from you whenever you have issues you'd like to deal with. I can tell you that.
Right.
The other office that I'm working with somewhat is with FDA. FDA as office, their division, the CIFSTAN division, which is the food safety division, is a mess. It's the only way I can say it. They are kind of antediluvian. They're the ones who said males and females had to have the same effects. They were the ones who said you have to have not linear, you have to have monotonic dose response curves. And anyone who has ever studied vitamins or minerals know you don't always have monotonic dose response curves, as well as the same thing can be true with endocrine disrupting chemicals. So I've been writing some letters and petitions, not just me, but with others to FDA to try to bring about some improvements there in their regulatory approaches.
Right. And while we're at this topic, I mean, CHEJ is doing some work as well to specifically change the way that contaminated sites or communities or the effect on communities is assessed by the Agency for Toxic Substances, Disease and Registry. Our Unequal Response campaign is looking to change the way that assessment is being done. So that's an area where we ourselves are looking to change sort of the environmental structure of a federal agency. There's a question here from Stephanie, and she's asking if you can give us, Linda, an update on the status of the report on carcinogens. I'm assuming you're familiar with that. Will the current administration and Congress protect it?
The report on carcinogens is a legislatively mandated report that's supposed to come out. Originally, it was supposed to be every year. Then it went every 2 years. When I was director of NTP, this is a responsibility of NTP to list chemicals that are known human carcinogen or reasonably anticipated human carcinogens. There are, at the moment, I think about 280 chemicals, or I should say substances that are listed, because it does include certain viruses, for example. We were blocked under the last administration from releasing a report on carcinogens on light at night, which is clearly associated with increased risk of breast cancer and maybe other types. And Department of Transportation objected to that report, and we were blocked. Reports on carcinogen, we went to, instead of issuing it every 2 years, it's supposed to be a rolling, you know, when an analysis completed and has gone through extensive external peer review, it's supposed to be provided to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who then provides it to Congress. I know that there was an ROC released in 2014. There may have been some other reports added to, it's a cumulative, basically, document. You can find it on the web. I can't give you exactly where it stands now, but it is considered an authoritative document that actually has legislative impacts, you know, on OSHA and on parts of EPA, and requires listing under Prop 65 in California.
Got it. Thank you. I know there's a question here that a couple different people have raised, and it has to do with artificial turf fields. Kristen asks, there has been a lot of discussion recently regarding PFAS used in the manufacturing of artificial turf fields. Could you speak to what kind of effects PFAS leaching from a field installation would have on the surrounding soil, plant, or wildlife?
Okay, I think artificial turf is a big problem, not just because of PFAS. I don't think I actually had read that PFAS was in them, but artificial turf is often made from like rubber tires. There's a lot of metals, heavy metals, for example, that are an artificial turf. If it's used inside, there's a lot of volatile compounds that can come out of it. The studies are definitely not conclusive, either the experimental animal studies which have been done, and there have been a few epidemiological studies, but I certainly am not in favor of putting artificial turf, say, in our kids' schools.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. I was not aware that there was such a problem. Let's see. We have a couple more questions here. So Sabrina Rhodes asks, here in Ivy City in Northeast DC, there's a chemical plant that does packaging and adhesives with ingredients such as formaldehyde and other toxic substances. This plant has been in business since the 70s with no proper supervision from the city's agencies. How can we get attention to this facility being grandfathered in so that toxic regulations don't apply to them according to Department of Environment to get them closed down? So I guess she's asking for advice as to how can they get attention to this facility.
Well, the way you get attention is you make noise. You get your legislative people involved. You talk to the press. If this is a really dirty facility that is, and this would not be unique, and you have real issues for fence line communities, you really need to get in and get some measurements. Now, sometimes you can start even with a citizen science approach. If you're starting by, say, looking at air pollution or soil pollution, you can often involve high school students, community college students to go in and do some measurements, for example, so that you can get a little bit of data to start with. You know, I don't think there's anything there are chemicals that were grandfathered in, but I don't know of plants that are actually grandfathered in. But again, I'm not an expert in that arrangement, but I would say that they need to start making noise. If it's in DC at the City Department of Environmental Conservation or whatever it's called, but you've got Congress right down the road. There are representatives who are not voting from the district who can start making noise. They can start writing, for example, to US EPA that this needs to be looked at. I don't have any other magic approach, but at least in my experience, it's the people who make the most noise will often get the most response.
Great, thank you.
We've noticed that as well.
For sure. And Stephen, I think we might be out of time.
Yeah, I think so too. I think this is a good place to thank everybody for coming to our session today, and to thank certainly our guest, Linda, for being here and taking the extra time, especially to respond to questions. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Linda as well. Great job, great job.
Stephen, we had over 75 people to join us today. It's one of our largest ones.
Okay, that's great, great.
Sharon, excuse me one sec, Sharon, is there a way that you've copied the chat and I could send it to me so I could see what some of the questions are? And
I've actually copied everyone, so.
Oh, that would be great. And I will say I am way too easy to find. So if there's a question that you really want to ask me, just you'll be able to find me online and send it to me.
Great, great. We will also send everybody a copy of the record or a link to the recording so after the call, so everybody will be able to have that to access and to share. So that will be available as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Linda, again. This has been a great session. We really enjoyed your thoughts and your responses to a lot of these tough questions. And we thank everybody for being here. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for
Bye.
listening.
Take care.